I'm an architect, and I've been lucky to work on some interesting buildings with some great people. Recently, I went to Venice with my wife. We hadn't been for 25 years when we were last there on our honeymoon, and we were young newlyweds with backpacks. Here's a photo of us on our anniversary. I'm happy to report that Venice was essentially the same as it was 25 years ago. Sure, there were even more tourists this time, but the Piazza San Marco, the Grand Canal, all of it seemed like it had always been the same. Being an architect married to an architectural historian, we bought a print of an 18th century engraving to bring home. Here it is. It dawned on me that the architecture of Venice today looks pretty much just like this, even though this picture is almost 300 years ago. And some of the buildings here are actually from the 15th century, and some of these are built on foundations that are even older than that. It seems like the Venice of the future will look like the past. That's when I had a reawakening. It was an architectural reawakening. It's an exciting time to be an architect. There are lots of ideas out there and some pretty amazing things getting built. There's some great architects in the news to follow. Famous architects like Daniel Libeskind, Rem Koolhaas, Frank Gehry, and Sir Norman Foster. Yes, he's been knighted by the Queen, and he's one of the wealthiest men in the UK. If you haven't heard their names, you've probably seen their buildings. In our business, we call them starchitects. Some of these buildings get to be so famous that they're mascots of their hometown, like Foster's building in London called the GHERKIN. It's part endearment, part criticism, but it's a type of contemporary celebrity. Another modern mascot is the bird's nest at the Beijing Olympics. There's an architect named ZAHA HADID who recently released a design for a new stadium in the Middle East. It was trending on Twitter for a while because people thought it looked like a vagina. In my work, I often get asked, what's next? Architecture is expensive. It takes time. We need to be in step with the culture. The future is coming, after all. It's just around the bend. It seems that all of us grow up with this notion of the future as being, well, futuristic, that it will all somehow look like the Jetsons. Disney has capitalized on our fantasies of the future, and we seem to pass this folklore down through generations. The future has a history. Maybe it started with the Industrial Revolution, but we eventually got to this point, this romantic idea called modernism, that technology itself is beautiful, if only it would hurry up and get here. I think at this point, it's important to remember that modernism is already at least 100 years old. Modernism isn't really modern at all. Virginia Woolf pegged the start of the modern movement at 1910, in December to be exact, when Manet was exhibited in London. By 1919, the Bauhaus was established in Germany, and they began building the buildings that look like what we think of today as modern. And by 1931, this building had been built in Philadelphia as the first modern-style skyscraper in America. The rest is history. Today, we see projects announced in the news that perpetuate this idea of modernism as inevitable. But isn't this the architecture of the last revolution? Is modernity our destiny? And what does that mean anyway? Have we arrived as a culture? Well, I believe there are cultural shifts everywhere that point to a new, dramatically different direction. I'd like to share 4 of these ideas, and the first of these is food and architecture. It now seems universally accepted that whole foods are best for our bodies. The idea all started with the slow food movement. Slow food was founded in Italy in the 80s as a response to a fast foods McDonald's opening at the foot of the Spanish Steps in Rome. A group of Italian foodies set up on a sidewalk in front of that McDonald's and passed out free bowls of pasta to passersby in gustatory protest. And the slow food movement was born. That McDonald's is still there, but the future of food has changed forever. Slow Food's motto is good, clean, and fair, and now any restaurant or grocery store worth its salt is bragging about its farm-to-table movement. Michael Pollan has had a string of bestsellers debunking the industrial food complex and the processed foods and synthetic additives that make us sick. This has spawned a transformation in organic farming and ignited a community garden movement. In other words, we're looking to the past for answers as far as food is concerned. We're going back to nature. We've had a gastronomic reawakening. The second of these 4 cultural shifts has to do with happiness. Happiness, it turns out, is serious stuff. Not long ago, the ruler of Bhutan announced that he was abolishing the GDP and instead was instituting the gross domestic happiness. That may sound a little flaky, but right in the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson named the pursuit of happiness as one of our 3 inalienable rights as Americans. Lately, there's a new science of happiness. In the last quarter century, sociologists, economists, neuroscientists have been testing us and conducting polls. They're compiling the data about what makes us happy. Authors of all stripes are picking through these findings to figure out what it means to daily life. For instance, money doesn't really make us happy. Neither does a high IQ. In America, a Gallup poll shows that we have flatlined in reported happiness over the last few decades. And as it turns out, even technology doesn't necessarily make us happy. Your chances of divorce are pretty much proportionate to your commute time in minutes. And people who live on the 6th floor have the highest suicide rates. And as far as obesity, people who live on the cul-de-sacs of suburbia are at the greatest risk. Where we live and the buildings in which we live have been documented as mattering gravely. So what does make us happy? Well, sex, for one, but so does a sense of community, family, commitment, and some form of spirituality. Even more to the point, scientific studies around the globe show that people are, in documented fact, happiest in traditional, old-fashioned towns. And as for architecture, well, our brains instinctively sense fear in sterile, undefined spaces. Blank walls, dead ends, windowless spaces make us anxious. These aren't questions. They're documented in research, although it may seem like we hardly needed to conduct a study to discover it. Scientists using brain scans prove that we don't feel safe around sharp architectural shapes. You probably get this by now. We are our most authentic selves in the places built like the old parts of town. Otherwise, well, our lives are literally in danger. Even the Starkitects get this. KOOLHAAS has said he lives in a historic Victorian apartment house in London, like the one we just saw. So it's with great happiness that I can say we've had a metropolitan reawakening. All of this leads to the third cultural shift, genetics, who we are as a species. And again, we're gaining new information constantly. The Human Genome Project is now almost 25 years old, and this type of work has extended to other animals and prehistoric man. And thanks to this research, we now know that our species has evolved almost not at all from our Paleolithic ancestors of 10,000 years ago. And most of these instincts that drive us, like love, intimacy, jealousy, and fear, all tie us inexplicably to our ancestors living in the wilderness. Even our sense of creativity is 10,000 years old. Darwin knew that we really hadn't evolved much recently. He knew that natural selection takes many tens of thousands of years. And besides, evolution is guided mostly by the weather. He knew that we were not on some steady march towards the future. We're part of the endless cycle of nature. And now we're at a point of deep introspection into what defines us as a species. We're beginning to see how we're meant to live. We have had an evolutionary reawakening. And the last cultural shift is about human life. What exactly is the relationship between people and machines? One of the flaws of futurism has always been population growth. It's the underbelly of modernism. It's a dirty little problem. The time bomb of the population explosion has been urban folklore since at least the 1970s. Think about the movie Soylent Green, or abortion, or the Chinese one-baby policy. This has recently been loosened, and somehow we've been trying to ignore the problem all over the world. And again, technology was going to be the answer, making more people more productive, letting them live more carefree lives. But the opposite often happens. The more that machines do the work, the higher unemployment rises. It's unfortunate because human power is the most efficient force on the planet. As little machines, we're clean, simply fueled, and we replicate ourselves. The vast sea of humanity is destined to do more, be more, make more. If you look at it this way, something made by hand can be the most efficient form of construction. Craft actually is green. And it follows that the more we make buildings that incorporate things that are handmade, the more sustainable they are. To put this in reverse, anything without apparent handmade elements is less green. We should have more ornament on our buildings. Machines are wasteful and unsustainable. We have had an environmental reawakening. The current state of architecture seems out of step with all these cultural shifts, and I'm not sure today's green architecture is really the answer either. Here's the cover of last month's Dwell magazine. Can a steel frame, all glass house sitting in a wetlands really be considered green? And is it right to use more and more technology as a band-aid to greenwash the architecture of the industrial age? Shouldn't we use our new age of information, all these shifts happening in the culture, to build buildings that are not just of our time, but timeless? It's time to peel away the modernism of the old industrial revolution, the fake future that's just a relic of our great-grandparents' modernity. It's time to see the future where it really lies, in the past. Not a future that never comes or goes out of style, but one that's achievable and accessible right now. Traditional architecture is built with local and organic materials. I like to think of it as slow architecture. Buildings in the past essentially came out of the ground or the forest, usually right nearby. They're durable and built for the ages. And the deeper we go into ancient history, the more relevant the buildings seem to be to our current world. We need to learn from these buildings. In fact, ancient buildings like this temple in Greece may be the most awesomely sustainable architecture we have on the planet. Pure, organic, local, handmade. So that was my reawakening, that the buildings I saw with my wife last year in Venice meant something for the past, for today, and for tomorrow. So that was, and that maybe, just maybe, the future won't look like we were led to believe. It won't look futuristic, but instead, it could look more like the past than we ever imagined. Thank you. Hey, thanks. Thank you.